Mama can't come, she's sick, so she sent me instead.
Mama can't come. She sent me instead. Ju Won Seok checked his Rolex for the third time. 7:47 p.m. The blind date his mother had arranged. You are 32, Ju Won. Stop drowning yourself in boardrooms and start building a life. Was supposed to have started 12 minutes ago. The restaurant hummed around him with the kind of quiet that only serious money could buy. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight. His assistant, Min Jae, sat at a corner table pretending to review documents on her tablet while very obviously watching his table. Ju Won was about to leave. He had already decided it, was already calculating how gracefully he could exit, when the restaurant door opened and the entire trajectory of his life quietly shifted. A little girl walked in. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with 2 lopsided pigtails and a blue dress with a small bow at the collar, slightly wrinkled, clearly chosen by herself. She carried a green backpack nearly as big as she was. She stood in the entrance for exactly 2 seconds, scanning the room with the calm, systematic focus of someone who had a job to do. Then she walked directly to his table. "Are you Ju Won?" she asked. Her voice was very serious. He blinked. "Yes." "Good." She climbed into the chair across from him and set her backpack on the white linen tablecloth with a soft thud that made a nearby waiter flinch. Then she looked at him with large, steady eyes and delivered her news as plainly as a weather report. "Mama can't come. She's sick. So, she sent me instead. We can't miss this because Miss Lorraine worked really hard to set it up." Ju Won Seok, who had closed billion-dollar mergers without blinking, who had stared down entire boardrooms without flinching, could not speak. Across the restaurant, Min Jae's tablet nearly slid off her table. "If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother and friends said I wouldn't reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this one deserve to be heard. Help me show them these tales truly matter. Please subscribe to Julia's Romance Library, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent." 30 minutes earlier, Kathleen McCarthy had been losing a very quiet battle. She lay on her apartment couch, shivering under 3 blankets despite the August heat. The flu had arrived without warning on Thursday afternoon, right in the middle of her double shift at Rosie's Diner. She had pushed through, finished her tables, counted her tips, smiled at the regulars. Then she had walked home, climbed 4 flights of stairs, and collapsed. She had meant to cancel the date. She had reached for her phone twice. But Miss Lorraine had spent 3 weeks arranging this, and Kathleen had spent 3 weeks trying to believe that something could go right, just once. And so she had drifted off telling herself she only needed an hour's rest. She had not accounted for Anabella. "Mama," her daughter had said, standing beside the couch with her hands folded. "You promised we would go to the nice restaurant tonight." "I know, baby. Mama's not feeling well. But you promised." Kathleen had closed her eyes, and the fever had pulled her under before she could answer. Anabella had stood there for a long moment, considering. Then she had gone to get her backpack. It had started as a headache. That was the lie Kathleen had told herself through the breakfast rush, through the lunch crowd, through 6 hours of balancing plates and forcing smiles and refilling coffee she couldn't stomach the smell of. Just a headache. Drink water. Keep moving. She had a daughter to feed and a landlord who didn't accept excuses and a blind date tonight that felt equal parts terrifying and foolish. But Miss Lorraine had said just try, Kathleen, just once. So she had kept moving. She stopped moving at 6:14 p.m. The walk home from the bus stop took 11 minutes on a good day. It took 23 that evening, and she remembered very little of it. She remembered the way the August heat felt wrong against her skin. Too close, too heavy, like wearing someone else's coat. She remembered gripping the stair railing on the second-floor landing and deciding, with great seriousness, that she would simply live on that landing forever and never climb again. She made it to the couch. She pulled every blanket within reach over herself, set her phone on the cushion beside her, and thought 1 hour. Just 1 hour, and then I'll call Miss Lorraine and explain. She heard Annabella's voice, soft and serious, somewhere above her. She tried to answer. The fever pulled her down like a current, fast, total, and absolute, and the last thing she registered before the darkness took her completely was the familiar sound of a zipper. A backpack zipper. She didn't think anything of it. Anabella knew 3 important rules about going somewhere alone. Write your name and address on a piece of paper. Stay where people can see you. Don't talk to anyone who looks at you too long. Mama had taught her these things the way she taught her everything, quietly, seriously, like small pieces of armor being buckled on one by one. She packed carefully. Crackers. A juice box. The folded paper with her name and their address written in red crayon. And Mama's phone, screen unlocked, with Miss Lorraine's last message pulled up, Plaza Grill, 7:30. Ask for the reservation under Seok. In case the restaurant man needed proof, she was supposed to be there. The bus stop was half a block down and 1 street over. She knew because she had counted once, walking with Mama, the way Mama always counted things without realizing she did it. Gerald, the driver, looked at her for a long moment when she stepped on. You riding alone, little bit? My mom is sick, Anabella said. I'm going instead. He studied her face, the serious eyes, the backpack, the quiet certainty of a child who had already made up her mind, and something in him settled. You tell me when you need your stop. I'll know it when I see the flower boxes, she said. He let her ride for free. She sat in the front seat, backpack on her lap, watching the city scroll past the window as the buildings grew taller and cleaner and the streets began to look like somewhere that had never heard of Larimer Street. She did not know that behind her, for floors up, her mother had just woken up screaming her name. Kathleen came back to herself at 8:19 p.m., and the first thing she did was scream her daughter's name. The apartment answered with silence. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not something she would ever fully describe to another person. The empty nightstand, the missing phone, the backpack hook by the door, bare, where the green backpack should have been. She called Miss Lorraine from the landline with shaking hands, and Miss Lorraine, God bless her, was already in her car, had already called the restaurant, had already been told by a very composed hostess that yes, there was a small child in a blue dress sitting across from Mr. Seok, and she appeared to be eating bread. They arrived at Plaza Grill at 8:31 p.m. Kathleen in her diner uniform, coat thrown over it, hair still pressed flat from the pillow. Miss Lorraine in her hospital scrubs, lanyard still swinging from her neck. They pushed through the entrance, past the hostess, past the pianist, past tables of people in evening wear who turned to stare with a slow, stunned fascination of witnesses at a scene they could not categorize. And there was Anabella, sitting straight in a velvet chair, twirling pasta around a fork with enormous concentration, while the man in the bespoke suit across from her watched with an expression Kathleen could not immediately name. Not irritated. Not amused. Something quieter than both. Hi, Mama, Anabella said, without looking up. He let me order the pasta with the long noodles. Kathleen opened her mouth. Ju Won Seok looked up at her. Really looked, and for reasons she wouldn't understand until much later, she forgot entirely what she had planned to say. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and feel free to share your thoughts or experiences. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe. Thank you. Kathleen said no to the ride 3 times. Ju Won waited through each refusal with the same unhurried quiet, the way a person waits for weather to decide what it wants to do. By the 4th silence, she was too exhausted and too feverish and too aware of Anabella drooping against her side to argue anymore. She got in the car. She stared straight ahead the entire ride. The car was the kind of clean that made her conscious of her uniform, her flat hair, the faint smell of diner grease she could never fully wash out on the days she worked doubles. She gave the address in a flat voice and watched the city outside the window change the way it always did, the flower boxes disappearing, The storefronts getting smaller and more honest, the streets narrowing back into something that looked like her real life. He pulled up in front of the blue building on Larimer without comment. She was out of the car before it fully stopped, Anabella on her hip, key already in her hand, and then she heard the door open behind her. She turned. He was standing on the sidewalk, looking at the building, at the front steps with a cracked second stare, at the playground beside it, the broken swing hanging by one chain, the rusted slide, the single streetlight doing its inadequate best against the dark. He stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said quietly. He wasn't looking at the playground anymore. He was looking at her. "Same time you climbed those stairs tonight, you worked a double shift." It wasn't a question. And somehow that was the thing she couldn't answer.
He called on a Tuesday.
2 weeks after the blue building. 2 weeks of silence that Kathleen had spent convincing herself was closure. She had rehearsed. In a quiet way, she rehearsed everything difficult, what she would say if he did call. Something polite and firm. Something that made clear she wasn't a project. That she didn't need anyone standing on her sidewalk doing the math on her life and feeling sorry about the answer. She picked up on the second ring. "I'd like to take you and Anabella to Riverside Park on Saturday," he said. No preamble. No corporate warmth. Just the plain fact of it, offered the same way Anabella offered things, directly and without apology. She almost said no. The word was right there, familiar and ready. "Why?" she said instead. A pause. Brief but real. "Because she told me her favorite color is the color of grass, and she hasn't been to a park with real grass in a long time." Another pause. "And because I'd like to know you. Not your circumstances. You." Kathleen stood in her kitchen for a long moment after she hung up, hand still on the phone, looking at nothing. Saturday came gray and cool, and Anabella wore her good shoes without being asked. Ju Won arrived without a driver, without Min Jae, without the careful architecture of importance he usually carried everywhere. Just a man in a plain jacket, holding a paper bag with 3 sandwiches. It was the most disarming thing Kathleen had ever seen. She watched him chase Anabella across the grass, laughing at something she couldn't hear, and felt something shift in her chest that she absolutely was not ready to name. He asked her once, at the park, what she would do if money wasn't the reason she couldn't. She had answered without thinking.
"Teach," she said.
Secondary school English. Maybe college one day. Then she had caught herself, the way she always caught herself, and looked away. "But that's not really a plan. That's just a thing I think about." He had not responded. She had assumed he'd forgotten. He had not forgotten. 3 weeks later, he sat across from her at a coffee shop on Meridian Street, neutral ground, her choice, and slid a single folded paper across the table. She opened it slowly. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading. A full tuition grant. The foundation for working mothers returning to education. Her name already typed at the top. "This isn't charity," he said, before she could speak. "I have funded 11 of these. I chose recipients based on one criterion, demonstrable strength of character under pressure." He held her gaze. "You sent your 6-year-old daughter across the city, rather than break a promise. That is not a sob story. That is a qualification." Kathleen stared at the paper. Everything in her that had been built for defense rose up at once. The pride, the suspicion, the old familiar fear of owing something to someone who had more power than she did. Her hands were shaking. "I don't want to need this," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I know," he said quietly. "That's exactly why I'm giving it to you." She folded the paper, unfolded it, stared at her name at the top. And for the first time in a very long time, Kathleen McCarthy didn't look away. Nobody warned Ju Won that falling in love with a family happened in the small moments. Not in the grand ones. Not in the restaurants or the parks or the carefully chosen words across coffee shop tables. It happened on a Wednesday night in November, on a living room floor that was approximately the size of his office bathroom, under a ceiling light with a bulb that needed replacing, while Anabella spread her math worksheet across the carpet and looked at him with the expression of someone presenting a formal problem to a consultant. "I don't understand borrowing," she said. Kathleen was at the kitchen table, buried in her second-year coursework, highlighter in hand, textbook propped against a stack of library books. She had been there since 7. It was now past 9. She hadn't looked up in 40 minutes, and Ju Won had stopped expecting her to, because he had come to understand that when Kathleen studied, she studied the way she did everything, completely and without apology. So he sat down on the floor. "Borrowing," he said, picking up her pencil, "is just asking your neighbor for something they have more of." Anabella considered this with great seriousness. "Like when Mama borrows eggs from Mrs. Paulson?" Exactly like that. From the kitchen, without looking up, Kathleen said softly, "She's going to ask Mrs. Paulson to explain subtraction now." Ju Won laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that surprised him on the way out. Anabella looked between them and smiled the small, private smile of a child who has noticed something the adults think she hasn't. And somewhere across the room, Kathleen's highlighter slowed, just slightly on the page. Nobody had expected it to be beautiful. That was the honest truth that Min Jae and Miss Lorraine admitted to each other quietly, standing side by side at the back of the small garden venue with their shoes off and their champagne glasses nearly empty. They had both braced, in their private ways, for something to go wrong. Because that was the origin story: a sick woman, a missing child, a billionaire struck speechless by a 6-year-old with crackers in her backpack. It was not the foundation anyone would have designed. And yet, Kathleen walked down the aisle in a dress she had found at a consignment shop on Meridian Street and altered herself at the kitchen table where she used to study. No veil. Hair natural, pinned loosely at the neck. She carried a small bunch of white flowers that Anabella had chosen, and Anabella herself walked beside her, serious-faced and proud in a yellow dress, holding the rings in a small velvet box like they were classified documents. Ju Won watched them come toward him and forgot, entirely, how to arrange his face into anything composed.
He didn't try.
When Kathleen reached him, he took her hand and she let him, without hesitation, without the old reflex to pull back, and Miss Lorraine made a sound beside Min Jae that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "Disaster," Min Jae murmured, shaking her head slowly. "Complete disaster," Miss Lorraine agreed, wiping her eye. They clinked glasses. Anabella, standing between her mother and Ju Won during the vows, reached up and took one hand from each of them without being asked. Nobody had expected it to be beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. The chalk was the part she hadn't expected to love. The sound of it. The clean drag across the board. The way a room full of 18-year-olds looked up when she wrote something they hadn't considered before. That particular silence, alert and alive, that meant something had landed. Professor Kathleen McCarthy had been teaching secondary English and composition at Alderton College for 3 years now, and she still arrived early every single morning. Not because she had to.
Because she wanted to.
Because this was the thing she had thought about and looked away from for so long that finally standing inside it still felt, on certain mornings, like something she had to confirm was real. She was erasing the board after her last class when Anabella appeared in the doorway. 14 now. Tall, self-possessed, wearing the expression she had always worn, that quiet, certain look of someone who has already done the math on a situation and arrived at her answer. She dropped into the front row desk and pulled out her own homework without ceremony. "How was class?" Kathleen asked. "Good." A pause. "Mrs. Okafor asked us what we want to be." "What did you say?" Anabella looked up. Completely serious. Completely herself. "CEO of life," she said. "I explained it's an executive position with full jurisdiction." Kathleen looked at her daughter. This child who had once crossed a city alone with a juice box and a folded piece of paper, To keep a promise on behalf of a mother who is falling apart and felt something so large and so quiet move through her that she couldn't speak. Just like the first night. Just like him. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for watching, for staying, for caring about Kathleen and Ju Won and that little girl in the blue dress the way you have. Drop a comment below and tell me what this story meant to you. And if you want more stories like this one, head over to Julia's Romance Library. There are more waiting for you there. Subscribe so you never miss a single one. These stories exist because you choose to listen. And I will never stop being grateful for that.